morning, and thank you for joining us. The Peterson Foundation Economic Forum brings together thought leaders for in-depth conversations on America's most pressing economic issues. Rarely in our nation's history have we faced such complex questions and uncertainty in our economic and fiscal health. Our economy is recovering, but there are key questions about inequality, inflation, the labor force, the supply chain, and more. We have a completely unsustainable fiscal outlook and have for a long time. Structural factors that existed long before COVID continue to threaten our preparedness for future challenges. And of course, we continue to grapple with the ongoing impact of this unprecedented pandemic. I believe that we have an important responsibility to examine with clear eyes our fiscal and economic condition and what steps we need to take to ensure broad-based prosperity for the future. To help improve the understanding of this critical moment, we asked some of the most insightful people we know to help answer the question, where do we go from here? We convened 12 leading experts with a range of bipartisan, diverse viewpoints to provide solutions for this uniquely challenging time. The questions we asked them were, 1, how does America's unsustainable long-term fiscal outlook impact our economy, budget, risk exposure, and global leadership position? 2, the pandemic has exposed a range of new and long-standing concerns about disparities in economic security and opportunity across the nation. Looking ahead, how does our long-term fiscal outlook threaten vulnerable populations, and how can fiscal policy help address this core challenge of capitalism? And third, America faces a range of significant ongoing challenges that will require resources, including climate change, health and retirement security, evolving global threats, and infrastructure needs here at home. What is the best way to build a sustainable fiscal outlook while also enabling the U.S. to have the resources it needs to address its greatest challenges over the long run? So basically, we just asked them to solve our most complex and biggest challenges in less than 2,000 words. No problem. I'm so pleased that two of our authors are here today. Let's bring on Bill and Sita. Bill Gale is the R.J. and Francis Miller Chair in Federal Economic Policy and a Senior Fellow in the Economic Studies Program at the Brookings Institution. He's co-director of the Tax Policy Center, a joint venture of Brookings and Urban Institute, and he's also the director of the Retirement Security Project. And he wrote one of my favorite books ever, Fiscal Therapy, Curing America's Debt Addiction and Investing in the Future. So Bill, thanks for joining us. Sita Slavov is professor of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She has previously served as senior economist specializing in public finance issues at the White House Council of Economic Advisors and a member of the 2019 Social Security Technical Panel on Assumptions and Methods. So thank you both for participating in this initiative and for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Let's just talk first a little bit about the current state of our economy. So let's start with you, Sita. Where do you think we are in the economic recovery right now, and how do you interpret the interaction of a bunch of complicated factors, the workforce, the supply chain disruption, ongoing COVID concerns? How do you see the overall outlook right now?
So I think the economy has recovered much faster than anyone was predicting back in March 2020. And, that's happened thanks to a combination of things, the vaccines, obviously, as well as the policy response. I think right now the biggest risk to the economy is inflation. That's something that seems to be picking up, and it's something that policymakers should really be concerned about. There is also this question of why people are not coming back into the labor market at the rate that they were prior to the pandemic. And I think right now we don't have a definitive answer of why that is. I suspect some of it may be early retirement, another part maybe because the government did a really good job of maintaining incomes, but for a year and a half there wasn't that much to spend money on other than basics like food and rent. So I suspect there are people who have some money saved up and they'd like to take some time off and make up for some of the things they missed out on, but that's something we'll see how that plays out over the coming months.
Tell me, how, the BLS came out with more concerning inflation data this morning, as you may have seen, 6.2% increase relative to last year and a 0.9% increase in just 1 month.
Yeah.
Is this transitory or permanent or somewhere in between? How do you see that? And then we'll go to you, Bill.
Well, I'm not a macroeconomist, so I'll preface my answer by saying that it's not, I would be concerned about longer term inflation. I'm not sure that it is transitory. So I think it is something that action needs to be taken.
Okay, Bill, where are you on where we are in the recovery and some of these other issues, including inflation?
I think the headline numbers are quite good in terms of the overall unemployment rate, but I think that masks some heterogeneity in the population in various groups, blacks, other minorities. The unemployment rate is still pretty high, and so we shouldn't settle for a low aggregate unemployment rate if it means that a variety of groups are still facing employment shortfalls. But I think what Sita said is right. The economy has come back relatively fast. We've had kind of a V-shaped recession and recovery, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that policymakers stepped up very fast in terms of providing both relief to cushion the effects of the pandemic and then stimulus to get the economy going again.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the fiscal outlook. Bill, starting with you, what are you looking at over the next 10 or 20 years as the most important indicators? Is it debt to GDP? Is it interest as a share of GDP? Are you looking at inflation and all of the above? How do you assess our fiscal health over the coming decades?
Interest rates, interest rates, interest rates. Everything else about the fiscal outlook is bad. We're running full employment deficits. We expect to continue running full employment deficits. We have Social Security and Medicare spending rising. We have revenue lagging. Low interest rates are like the child with the finger in the dike holding back the waters. If interest rates stay low, the situation is manageable for a long time. If interest rates start rising, the situation gets ugly fairly fast.
Do you look at the state of the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency? I mean, that seems to be an important factor for exactly what you're worried about? Do you sense some deterioration of that, or are you concerned about that?
I feel like that discussion has increased in frequency and severity, if you will, over the last 2 decades. I don't know, if cryptocurrency is going to be the thing that comes along and finally the straw that breaks the camel's back. But there's been a lot more discussion of the issue, and that parallels the fact that U.S. dominance in the world economy has changed and isn't quite what it used to be.
Okay, so you're not going to be like our new mayor in New York and take your first 3 months salary in cryptocurrency.
I'd be happy to take his salary in cryptocurrency.
Not sure he would, but I get it. Sita, tell me, what are you looking at in terms of the fiscal outlook and how you assess our health over the coming years?
I think debt to GDP is obviously one of the key indicators, and right now, I mean, we're at more than 100% of GDP, and debt is projected to grow to 200% of GDP. That's an unprecedented level, and it's really concerning. I think it imposes potentially large burdens on future generations. These are people who haven't been born yet, don't get to vote, and I think it puts us at risk of a financial crisis. Beyond kind of the standard deficit and debt numbers, I think it's also important to look at long-term financial shortfalls in programs like Medicare and Social Security, which also don't look good. Now, I agree with Bill on the role of interest rates. I mean, real interest rates net of inflation have been very low for the past decade, and that does make government borrowing less costly. And I have seen some people claim that because interest rates are so low, government borrowing is basically a free lunch, which is something I think economists across the political spectrum would probably raise some concerns with, because interest rates are low right now. There is always a risk that interest rates could go up, and if they do, they could require a fiscal adjustment during a time that it's going to be especially painful. But it's definitely important to look at what's happening with interest rates, and it's something that's likely to shape how sustainable government borrowing is, as well as the public discussion around it.
Okay, one of the questions we asked in this initiative was how this unsustainable, challenging fiscal outlook impacts vulnerable populations. So, Sita, starting with you, what risk do you see to those vulnerable populations in the event of some of these fiscal predictions coming true that we're worried about?
Yeah, so I think lower income individuals depend much more heavily on programs like Social Security and Medicare. So, for example, if you're at the lower end of the income distribution, Social Security is likely to be a much bigger part of your retirement income compared to, say, private retirement saving. So when these programs' financing is at risk, it's lower income people, more vulnerable people who bear more of the uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future. So, I think that's one clear step that policymakers could take, and that is to act now rather than later to put these programs on a sound financial footing, because the uncertainty about their future does tend to disproportionately hit people who are vulnerable.
Bill, I want to ask you about some of the details on your paper, but generally speaking first, how do you see the balance of sort of fiscal responsibility and the outlook of the debt versus some of the concerns Sita's mentioning about vulnerable populations and their exposure to that?
It feels a little bit to me like a kind of a classic Wall Street versus Main Street type of discussion, in that if the mantra that's out there right now is we can't afford to do these things to help low and moderate income people now because we need to save the money so that we can help them later. That doesn't seem like a good way to frame it to me, and B, it's sort of a false choice. We can help them now and later if we raise taxes on wealthy households, and we can resolve the fiscal situation as well if we do that. So I think your question highlights the fact that all these things, the fiscal outlook, tax reform, social policy, the response to the pandemic, they're all linked, and we can address all these things at the same time. But if people refuse to address one of them, like raising taxes, that then makes it hard to address the other issues.
Right. Well, okay. So in your book, that was a lot of what you talked about, right? I mean, you had a comprehensive solution that included structural tax reforms to raise revenue, reduce growth in the entitlement program, and meaningful investments in public infrastructure and human capital. So, is that sort of what you're talking about in terms of the solution? You can basically revitalize our fiscal outlook by making those adjustments while also providing funds for investment.
Yeah, I think that basically those three components are still the components of a solution. I think I might reweight them a little differently now, with a little less emphasis on clawing back the debt, and a little more emphasis on addressing social policy or health, economic policy, including health insurance, aid to low-income families, and so on. And that's just because of when the facts change, my mind changes too. I think the presence of low interest rates provides an opportunity to make these high rate of return investments, and the pandemic has increased the need for these type of investments.
Okay. Sita, how do you look at some of these topics about how to balance the vulnerable populations and the needs versus the fiscal outlook? Is that a Wall Street versus Main Street thing in your eyes, or no?
So I think it's it's largely a value judgment. Whether we sort of have generous programs, generous safety net type programs, or social insurance programs. The thing is, we've got to cover the costs in a credible way, and I think you see a lot of evidence that people support these types of programs, support expanding support for, say, vulnerable populations and lower income individuals, but the philosophy right now seems to be that we're going to cover it without raising taxes on anyone except those at the very top of the income distribution. So basically what it seems like the vast majority of us is saying is that we like these programs as long as someone else is paying for them. I think there's survey evidence showing that when you start asking people if they're willing to pay higher taxes for programs like this, support tends to drop off pretty fast. But if you look over at the Western European countries and the way they finance their generous welfare states, they rely on very broad-based sort of pro-growth taxes, like value-added taxes. And even if you look at their income taxes, they're less concentrated at the very top end of the distribution, and they fall more broadly on middle income individuals. So ultimately, I think if we want these things, taxes on the middle class, broadly defined, do have to go up. And I think that's the trade-off. We need to be honest about that. And I think that puts me in the same camp as someone like Bernie Sanders, who has acknowledged that taxes probably need to go up if we want more generous social programs.
Well, let's talk about some of the ways to raise more revenue. You mentioned here and in your paper things like a carbon tax and a value-added tax. Go in a little deeper into those types of options and why you think those are worth considering.
Yeah, so I think these taxes tend to be more pro-growth. So a value-added tax is essentially a tax on consumption. It does not penalize investment and savings. So it's more pro-growth than an income tax. A carbon tax as well, it addresses a market failure. It addresses the spillover costs of carbon emissions for climate change. So these types of taxes tend to make the economy run more efficiently compared to, say, raising income taxes at the very top end, because these highly progressive income taxes tend to be less pro-growth than these other options. So I would favor, we probably need more revenue, and we should turn to these more broad-based pro-growth sources.
Mm-hmm. Bill, how do you respond to that? Do you I forget what was in your book in terms of specifics, but do you like bringing in these new forms of taxation in addition to some of the other structural reforms you propose?
Yeah, I think eventually we're going to need both a VAT and a carbon tax, as I wrote in the book. I think the key issue, we were talking about linking before, the key issue is how the revenues from those taxes get spent. If you spend VAT on universal health care or child care allowances or universal basic income, it becomes a progressive tax and spending combination. Likewise, if you rebate carbon taxes or some of the carbon taxes, it becomes a progressive set of policies. So I think we're headed there. But I think politically and economically, I'm surprised that the next step is not taxes on incredibly affluent households. I've been generally surprised that the Democrats have not been able to find the support to undo some of the more egregious features of the 2017 Tax Act, which, of course, they all universally opposed. In particular, the pass-through deduction, the lower corporate rate, the state tax exemptions. On top of that, they could tax capital gains at death, and those changes alone would bring in substantial revenue. it's right that we can't do all of this by taxing the rich, and I'm not sure anyone has proposed that we can do all of it by taxing the rich. But it seems like the right next step is to do that and to bring in the middle class via the VAT and the carbon tax only after uh, the big loopholes at the top have been shut down.
Okay, let's talk about some of the things, Bill, you mentioned in your paper in terms of investments that you think are critically important. Um, you wrote, investing in people and infrastructure would benefit the economy so much that we cannot choose not to. So help us understand, first of all, a question. I think you mentioned 1% of GDP as a target amount. Is that inclusive of the current legislation going on, or is that on top of that? And talk a little bit about how you get to that level of spending being the right amount.
Oh, it would be, this is in the book, it would be inclusive of what just the infrastructure bill that just passed, but it's larger than that. I think there's mounting evidence that investment in children, investment in healthcare for Medicaid exposure, for example, there's mounting evidence that those programs pay off quite substantially in the long term in terms of people getting jobs, people being healthier, people paying taxes, et cetera. So there's a significant investment component to those things. And of course, the costs of those initiatives have come down as interest rates have come down. So my view has shifted toward making more of those investments of the type that are laid out in the Build Back Better framework. This is, again, conditional on both the trends in interest rates and the emerging evidence. So I think there's room, there's an opportunity to make some good long-term investments that would raise the growth of the economy, but the investments would be in people, in human capital, if you will, rather than in physical capital. The infrastructure bill takes care of the physical capital part.
Okay, can you help us understand how that can dynamically benefit the federal budget, et cetera? I mean, you talked about growth and economic growth, increased tax revenues from it, et cetera. Do they pay for themselves entirely? Do they pay for themselves partially, or is revenue needed to basically fund those programs over the long haul?
I think the idea, the narrative is that kids that are more educated, that don't go to bed hungry, that have their health care taken care of, grow up to be more productive adults, both in the positive sense of uh, being, getting better jobs, earning higher wages, paying taxes, and in the not creating the negative sense of welfare dependence or criminal activity, and so on. Whether they actually literally pay for themselves or there's simply, big responsive partial payoff in the future. I'm not going to fall on the sword about that, but the point is, this is an alternative to sort of classic trickle down supply side economics, which basically says if you cut taxes for rich people, you will help poor people. This is saying if you help poor people directly via health, education, childcare, etc., that they will turn out better, more productive as adults.
Sita, where are you on some of these issues? I know you talked a little bit about this in your paper, how to make things more progressive vis-a-vis the revenue collection and the spending. Tell us a little bit about your thinking there.
Yeah. So, I mean, so on the spending side, I did talk a little bit about how to change programs like Social Security and Medicare, and my preference would be to essentially make the benefits more progressive. I mean, there are already features in the Social Security benefit formula that make it progressive, where monthly benefits do increase with a measure of your earnings over your lifetime, but they increase less than proportionally. So someone who earned a lot over their lifetime would receive a lower monthly benefit as a share of their earnings compared to someone who earned low average income over their lifetime. So there's already that feature in Social Security, and I would favor making it more progressive. Some might call that means testing. It kind of depends on how you define means testing. I do think there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. The right way to do it, for me, would be to continue to look at earnings over the lifetime, as the current benefit formula does. There have been proposals to means test Social Security based on a beneficiary's current income, and I think that could have some adverse incentive effects, where it is likely to discourage beneficiaries from, say, continuing to work, or it might encourage financial manipulation, for example, timing the withdrawals from retirement accounts to lower or raise your or reallocate income across years. But the Social Security Administration does have your entire earnings history, and the benefit formula could be made more progressive based on your lifetime income, which is probably a better measure of your means. So that's something I would favor, and I think I have even suggested that it would be reasonable to consider making the Social Security benefit flat, where everybody gets the same amount. I mean, you could make it increase with career length. So I think if you look over at the UK, they do something like this, where the benefit you get in retirement is flat. It doesn't depend on your earnings, but it does depend on the number of years that you worked, earning at a particular threshold earnings. So something like that, I think, is worth considering, and that could actually raise benefits for people at the bottom, virtually eliminate poverty among older people, while helping the system's finances.
Bill, how do you respond to some of those things? I mean, politically speaking, any adjustment whatsoever is often, sort of off the table. But what Sita's describing is pretty well targeted to those with lower incomes. Do you see any opening for that, or do you think that would be effective in some of the goals you have on progressivity?
Yeah, I think Sita made a lot of good points. A couple of things for perspective. We can't get people to wear masks. We're not going to get people to support cutting Social Security, the single most popular thing the government does. And that means we're not going to make changes now while we have the operating room. Politicians are going to push this to the limit. And in fact, they could beyond the limit being when the trust fund runs out of money. There's a very simple mechanism by which they could simply say, we're going to fund Social Security out of general revenue. I'm not advocating that, but given the way things are going, I think it's a distinct possibility that happens. If they do make reforms to Social Security, I imagine they would be of the nature that Sita mentioned, that is cutting benefits for high income earners. I don't know if they would go all the way to a flat benefit, but it's going to be very hard to cut Social Security benefits generally. One of the few polling results that I have any faith in is that it's pretty consistent over the years, is people say that if there's a problem with Social Security and Medicare, they would rather have the government raise taxes than cut benefits to resolve that issue. So I just think Social Security is going to be incredibly difficult. They're not going to make changes until their back is against the wall, and because of this borrowing option, their backs may never be against the wall.
Okay. I guess, do you think what you're saying is sort of political reality, and I get that. Just substantively, are there people on the left that would support that? Taking benefits from high earners, and even if it was spending neutral, allocating that to lower income folks, is there any appeal to that systematically?
Yeah, I think that's the first thing anyone would do.
Right.
I mean, it's the equivalent of taxing the rich in Social Security.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the current legislation. Sita, how do you view the infrastructure package that was passed last week?
Okay. Yeah. So the infrastructure package, I think there's a lot of good things in that. There are some badly needed investments in infrastructure that I think the moderates in both parties recognize as important. Now, I don't like the fact that it increases the deficit. Given our current fiscal situation, I think that moves things in the wrong direction. But infrastructure spending is different from other kinds of spending in that it is an investment. So it's something that future generations can benefit from. So I would worry less about borrowing money to fund infrastructure investment.
Okay, so you're raising a stark differentiation between debt financed consumption and debt financed investment, right? So talk a little bit more about why that's important.
Yeah, so when the government borrows money, it competes with private borrowers and likely crowds out some private investment in capital that benefits future generations. But if the government's using the borrowed money to invest in something like infrastructure, it's replacing that private investment with public investment that does have payoffs for future generations. So I think it's something that's less concerning if you're funding investment spending with debt.
Is that how you look at it too, Bill?
Basically, yes. I mean, it's not just a matter of how much debt there is; it's a matter of what the money's being used for. And as Sita mentioned, there are these long-standing deficits, if you will, infrastructure deficits in everything from roads and ports and airports to lead in the drinking water. And it strikes me that this is a good use of funds, and yeah, it would be nice if this didn't increase the deficit, but this is precisely the type of program where the deficit concerns are less than they would be if, say, they were just increasing Social Security benefits.
Okay. Let's talk about the Build Back Better plan and how that's shaping up. Starting with you, Sita, what's your favorite and least favorite? So if something had to stay in, what would you want to see stay in? If you had to get rid of something, what would be the first item off the list?
That's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about my favorite and least favorite parts of it. I think it does contain a lot of popular spending programs. Things like paid family leave could make sense. Child tax credits; those are also very popular. And I think whether we as a society want programs like this, I think that's largely a value judgment. We're going to have to decide if they're worth the cost. I think the real concern I have with the bill is the financing of these programs. I think it's I don't find it credible. I don't think it's going to end up covering the actual costs. I'm also not sure it makes sense to add more social programs when existing social programs are facing financial shortfalls that nobody seems to want to deal with. But even if it is credible, I think it's based on this unsustainable approach to policy that nobody except those at the very top of the income distribution should pay higher taxes. I think we're at something like nobody making less than $400,000 is going to pay higher taxes. That seems to be the commitment. But somebody making $300,000, they're pretty well off too. So that's middle class, very, very broadly defined. And like I said, the underlying philosophy seems to be we like these programs as long as someone else is paying for them. I would much prefer, if we're going to do this, to fund them using more broad-based pro-growth taxes.
Okay, Bill, what's most precious to you in the legislation? I get the sense from your paper that a lot of it is right up your alley, but what do you think is most critical?
I think they do a fairly good job on the spending side. The universal pre-K, affordable childcare, clean energy, subsidies for clean energy, the tax treatment of children. There's an expansion of Medicaid and health coverage. They're repealing the drug rebate rule, which is good. the concerns I have are on the tax side, and there's several. First of all, expanding the SALT deduction is a terrible idea, and it should just be axed. Second, there's a whole bunch of things that
Why
happen.
is it? Just give us a little more on that, because I'm sitting in New
Oh,
York and a lot of people would disagree with you. So explain
it's
that.
it's a very highly regressive. Expanding the deduction would be very highly regressive and kind of could well end up giving high income payers a tax cut, which a net tax cut, which doesn't make any sense in the broader context of the bill. CETA is worried that only people above 400,000 are going to pay any new taxes. With a properly expanded SALT deduction, some of them may be paying less taxes. So it's crazy on two dimensions. The worst part of the tax side is the SALT. The second thing, which I find quite surprising, is there are these various features in 2017 that all the Democrats voted against that they haven't voted to reinstate. For example, raising the corporate rate, ending the pass-through deduction, uh, uh, making the estate tax more significant, things like that, that just fell by the wayside. And then there are other good ideas on the tax side, like taxing gains at death, that didn't make it in as a result of a fairly dishonest lobbying campaign. And then the things they're left with on the tax side are just not really. They're not kind of the first team of tax increases. We've got an AMT, which is sort of an admission of failure because it means we can't get the regular tax base right. We've got these surtaxes on income, but we're not closing the base, so there's going to be a lot of avoidance from that. And I mean, I understand. The best thing you can say about the tax side is that their goals are good and they're trying to find some political deal, and it's turning out to be very messy. But I feel like I give them an A or an A minus on the spending side, but a much lower mark on the tax side.
How do you think it's going to be scored?
Uh, I, if I had to guess, I would guess it would be scored as a uh, somewhat of a deficit, a few $100 billion over 10 years. I got to say that in a 24, $25 trillion economy, uh, that does not strike me as enormous. It's not in the right direction as far as solving the long-term fiscal problems, but it not. Again, I want to focus on what the money gets you, and I think it gets you a lot of things that people value. And I mean, if I could wave a wand and rewrite the tax side, I think I could solve the structural and the revenue issues. But again, they're trying to reach a political deal, and that's often it's easy to criticize. I've done it myself, and will continue to do so. But the option is either no deal or a political deal, not the deal that I or any other economist would come up with.
Sita, just any response to some of those topics?
I'm completely in agreement on the SALT deduction. It's something public finance economists repeat frequently when it comes to tax reform is you got to broaden the base and lower the rates. And politicians, they love lowering rates. They're not as much fans of broadening the base, but that's very important. And the SALT deduction is this thing that's carved out of the tax base, and it largely benefits higher income individuals. So it seems to me that getting rid of it completely actually would serve the distributional goals of folks on the left by hitting higher income taxpayers harder, and it would also be pro-growth in that it broadens the base. So it seems to me like that's a no-brainer, but it doesn't yeah. It
Well,
doesn't seem to be
people
happening.
in places like New York, okay, will say that it's unfair to states that have a high level of taxation, they have a high degree of services and safety nets and so forth. Bill, what do you say to that argument? I mean, I get where you're coming from the progressivity of the tax code, but does it have other impacts on state and local spending, for example?
I think there's a legitimate point in there, but I think in the current situation, it's swamped by the whole thrust of the Build Back Better initiative and what the administration says it's trying to do. I mean, there is a theoretical case, but it's more complex and subtle than anything that's entered the public debate, and it just seems like the wrong time, the wrong situation, the wrong set of circumstances to be trying to make that case.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the political dysfunction. You both talked about that in your papers. Sita, what do you think we can do about that? I mean, you're out here putting forth good ideas. That's one thing. We certainly appreciate and support that. But what else can be done to kind of bring people together and solve some of these challenges? Because I think there's probably more agreement within the citizenry than the politicians probably on some of these things. So I know you've looked at that.
Yeah, I mean, putting these ideas out there and discussing them, I think is kind of an obvious first step. I mean, certain things might be politically feasible. That doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to push them. Because who am I to speculate about political feasibility? There are things that were considered politically infeasible at one time that ultimately did come about. So, something like the Affordable Care Act, I'm not sure people might have envisioned that something like that would have been politically feasible, yet it happened, right? So I think, putting the ideas out there, continuing to put them out there, even if they might be politically infeasible currently, that's something that we should be doing. I would like to see the moderates in both parties work together a little bit more, because I think there is quite a bit of common ground there, and we did see some of that in the infrastructure bill.
Yeah, I think there's not so many of them left. Is the only problem, right? It's
that's
polarization.
Unfortunate.
Yeah. Any comments? I want to go to a couple of questions from the audience. Any comments on how to solve America's political dysfunction, Bill, before we go to them?
Just a couple. I yield to no one in my cynicism about the U.S. Congress, but I will say that just because something is politically infeasible right now does not mean it will be politically infeasible forever. Things change. I don't have an exact model of how to do this, but it's possible. I can't tell you how we get there from here, but I think it's possible. I do want to say that I have said for 20 years that the future of the government and the country depends on moderate Republicans. And this is sort of my take on what Sita just said, that the moderates need to work together. I think that parts of the Republican Party are going off the table. And the key issue is whether the remaining moderates, are going to work with the moderate Democrats, or whether they're going to stick with the increasingly fringe elements of the Republican Party.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to a few questions from the audience. There's a number of questions about inflation. We talked a little bit about it earlier. One is, how do we combat inflation, especially next year? With receding fiscal support do the job, or do we need more tools? whoever wants to take that. Bill, you're smiling.
Yeah, because it's a hard question, and I would like to know the answer. I think keep there's a relation here between the fiscal side and the monetary side. One thing we have not discussed is that the Fed plans to start tapering off its purchase of government bonds, and presumably someday it's going to want to sell off its portfolio of government bonds. That's going to put more pressure on interest rates in the fiscal situation. But I think with inflation, the best, the ideal thing would be sort of a do no harm scenario, but then you want to balance that against the opportunity to invest in children and healthcare and families and all that.
Okay, Sita, do you have the magic bullet on inflation?
Well, I don't know that I have the magic bullet, but I agree with Bill that the Fed's going to play a large role here too. This is largely dependent on what the Fed decides to do.
Okay, we have a question about the impact of rising debt on America's role in the world. So that's something we've worked on a little bit, which is as we pile on all this debt in the coming decades, at what point does that deteriorate our position, our ability to influence the world? Is that something, Sita, starting with you, how do you feel about that? Is that a concern? At what point do other nations begin questioning our credit and our stature, so to speak?
I mean, that's a concern because piling up this amount of debt is dependent on the willingness of investors to hold that debt. And, at some point, it's hard to say exactly what that point might be. That willingness might be reduced, and then we have a real problem. I also think having this much debt constrains us in our response to any type of crisis that might come along, and our ability to show leadership in these crises. The pandemic is a perfect example. We were at the peak of the business cycle, running like $1 trillion deficit. And then the pandemic comes along, and that level of deficits and debt and shortfall in government financing, we shouldn't have come into the crisis with that level of the deficit, because it does constrain policymakers in terms of what they can do to address a crisis. So I do think it can impede our ability to respond to crises and to show leadership globally.
Mm-hmm. Bill, what are your thoughts on this question?
It's a great question. Low interest rates that have persisted over the past decade or since the Great Recession are prima facie evidence that the world has been begging us to issue debt. The world wants to buy our debt right now. They have wanted for the last year, and that's why interest rates are so low. Whether that's going to last is a good question. Ryan Rydell, in his essay for the Peterson Foundation, says basically he has this great part that there's $112 trillion in debt that'll be issued in the next 30 years. Who's going to buy that? And that's a pretty stark way of asking the question. I don't have the right answer. I don't know that I have the right answer. I do know that there's been a lot of discussion of fiscal space, and everyone who has had an opinion about fiscal space the last 20 years has been wrong, myself included. So I don't think there's any issue that the U.S. can literally pay its debt the next 30, 40, 50 years. From an economic perspective, the only issue is whether Congress chooses to mess around with the debt ceiling and not extend it, and cause a political default. But I think, having said all that, which sounds on the optimistic side, I do think there is a concern about this $112 trillion debt that Brian mentioned, and who's going to buy it. I don't know what the answer is, but it's a lot of money, and it's something we should think about.
Okay, thank you. We have a number of questions about taxation. One is about IRS enforcement. How reliable a strategy is that in terms of revenue gains? Is that progressive or not progressive? How does that going to score? Bill, I know you work a lot at the Tax Policy Center on a range of tax issues. How do you all look at that?
So 1 out of every $7 that's owed to the government is not paid. And it's not a mystery where this money is. It's in farms, it's in partnerships, it's in sole proprietorships. Maybe some of it is offshore. But it's basically in high income business type of applications. And the reason is because there's not the withholding on that kind of income that occurs when people earn wages and pay their taxes. So the Biden administration has two pronged attack on this. One is increasing IRS resources for computers and audit staff on a sustained basis. That's about an $80 billion proposal. It's supposed to bring in about $320 billion gross, 240 net. It's tremendously needed. The IRS computers, some of them are older than I am. The audit staff has fallen by almost a third in the last 10, 20 years. Audit rates of top corporations and top individual income groups have fallen dramatically. We really need to boost that. The other component of the Biden administration plan is a request that a rule that financial institutions report on accounts with gross inflows or outflows above a certain amount. That's been the target of enormous controversy. Personally, I think it makes sense, but it's facing a much tougher battle than the battle for increased IRS resources.
Okay, Sita, any views on enforcement?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to argue that enforcing our tax laws, that's a good thing. I think I'm a little skeptical of estimates of how much revenue that's going to bring in. I suspect there's a lot of uncertainty around that, so it remains to be seen, I think, how that's going to pan out.
Can I just add, too, the revenue estimates are for the actual effects of the audited returns. They don't account for any increase in voluntary compliance where people say, oh, geez, the IRS is getting serious about this. I better start reporting my income. You're right, the estimates are uncertain. They've ranged from like 4 to 1 to 11 to 1 in terms of dollars spent on auditing versus revenues from auditing. There does seem to be a lot of money out there that could be reined in, and I totally agree with Sita. Enforcing the tax system is a no-brainer. Of course, we should enforce the tax system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Bill, let's talk a little bit about capital gains. As you well know, the income tax is actually quite progressive in terms of all those rates. I think a lot of the challenges come from the fact that the type of income that wealthier Americans have varies substantially, a lot of it from capital. How do you look at that issue in terms of how to make it more progressive, how to capture some of this revenue? I think some of the people avoiding taxes probably fall into that category where it's not regularized W-2 income. To me, that's one of the core challenges of capitalism is this income shifts in terms of its type. How do you raise the right level of revenue?
Sita mentioned earlier the importance of focusing on the base as opposed to rates in tax reform discussions, and I totally agree with that. And capital gains is like the poster child for focusing on the base rather than the rates. Right now, there's this enormous loophole that capital gains at death are the basis of those assets are stepped up so that the assets are inherited at the current market value, and the capital gains that accrued during the initial investor's lifetime are never subject to tax. The simplest thing to do would be to not allow the basis step up. I think a more appropriate thing to do would be to actually tax the gains at death. That is to treat death as a taxable event. Uh, uh, the even
What's,
more
what's the
ambitious.
difference? What's the difference between those two? Can you clarify that?
Sure.
If you eliminate the step up, is that not the same? Yeah.
Step up at base, eliminating step up of bid basis at death means that the person who gets the asset gets it with the original cost, and so when they sell, they have to pay capital gains on the whole gain of the asset. Taxation of death says death is a realization. Capital gains are going to be paid at that point, and then the person who inherits the asset inherits it at the new value.
Okay. So it requires it to be liquidated and paid effectively, or
right,
paid.
or it requires it to be paid. It doesn't require that the asset literally be liquidated. And then the third option, which is more ambitious, is what Senator Wyden has proposed, which is that we treat December 31st as a realization event, and every year we tax unrealized gains. Whereas capital gains at death only taxes it once in a lifetime, Wyden would tax it every year. Personally, I don't think we are ready for that, and the reason is because we haven't even done taxation at death. My view is let's do taxation at death. Let's get the kinks worked out of that, and then if people want to talk about taxing unrealized gains, that's a debate to be had later.
Sita, how do you think about taxing capital gains, et cetera, and incentive structures and some of those concerns?
I think taxing capital gains is kind of a minefield. I mean, in theory, it makes sense. So, I mean, ideally, in theory, it makes sense to tax unrealized capital gains because, you know, if we're talking about having a broad base for an income tax, that is a form of income, and that you could potentially sell those assets and use the proceeds. So in theory, it makes a lot of sense to tax unrealized capital gains. You also reduce the distortion that comes from people having an incentive to hold on to assets. Being reluctant to sell them and buy other assets that may have higher returns because they don't want to have to pay capital gains tax. So I think in theory it makes a lot of sense. In practice, I think that's where the difficulty is. I mean, looking at proposals to tax unrealized capital gains, they would focus on assets that are publicly traded because it's easy to determine what those unrealized capital gains are. But then there's a lot of assets where you can't determine that value. So it seems to me that you would then be taxing the unrealized capital gains on some assets, but not others, which could create its own distortions. I guess I largely agree with Bill that we do want to try to get at this, but it's unclear what the best way to do it would be because it's difficult.
Okay, thank you. We're almost out of time, but I'll ask one more question that we have here on climate provisions. We didn't talk about that much today, so we'll start with you, Bill, and then Sita, you can close us out. How do you see the climate provisions of the Build Back Better plan affecting the economy, as well as the price of energy for families in the short term?
I can't mention climate provisions without mentioning that what we should really do is a carbon tax. The administration has not adopted that approach. There's always this question when you want to encourage certain activities, do you tax the bad side or do you subsidize the good side? They've chosen to subsidize the good side with subsidies for clean energy. We may well need both a carbon tax and subsidies for clean energy, as well as subsidies for research and stuff like that. But this is your irrelevant economist reminder of the day that if we really want to address climate change, we need to start with a carbon tax.
Thank you, Mr. Irrelevant Economist. Sita, do you want to let's close this out with any thoughts you have on these climate provisions or how to deal with the climate in general?
Yeah, I'm going to echo that. My preferred solution would be a carbon tax. that it's so flexible because it allows people to essentially it forces people to consider the climate effects of all their choices, and it gives them the flexibility to reduce their contribution to carbon emissions in the way that's least painful to them, as opposed to sort of politicians picking and choosing what activities they want to encourage or discourage. So my preferred option would be a carbon tax, and we talked earlier about how to deal with this issue of feasible, but we should still be advocating for it if that is sort of from an economic standpoint the best solution.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll close things out. Bill and Sita, thank you so much for your participation in this initiative and for joining us today. And thanks to our audience for being with us. I would encourage everyone to go read the other papers. We have 10 other brilliant and insightful, sometimes irrelevant economists who we've worked with here, and they're all available at pgpf.org. So thanks everyone for participating today. We'll see you next time.